Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you're a returning subscriber, welcome. Hope you're having an amazing day. See what happens when you join and subscribe to the Ethics Experts. You get a bonus greeting on every episode. So hit that subscribe button. I am here with Jocelyn Davis. Hello, Jocelyn. How's it going?
Hello, Nick. It's going great.
So happy to have you on here today. I read your book, The Quiet Art of Influence, last year as part of my 100 book challenge, and I really love it. It stuck with me. I've used so many anecdotes for it. So thank you so much for joining us on the Ethics Experts. You know, the whole point of this podcast is really to help ethics and compliance professionals and HR professionals elevate from being a cost center in their organization to the strategic lever that in the knowledge work economy that we're a part of today, they can really unleash in. And a big way that they're going to get there, I think, is through internal influence. And many times they don't have authority within the organization. So this was super resonant for me, and just so happy to get you on here to pick your brain and see what this whole influence game is all about.
Great. My pleasure.
So let's just kind of dive in. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what brought you to, write this book?
Sure. So I had a very long career in the leadership and sales development industry, basically corporate training, with a company called the Forum Corporation, which has now been absorbed into another larger company. But I worked in many capacities there, but eventually I was the EVP of R&D. So I was doing the research and developing our products, which were training programs for leaders primarily, and as well as salespeople. And one of the programs that our company offered, and one of the first topics of research that the company ever did way back in like the late 70s, was on this topic of influence. That is, influence without authority. So I was sort of steeped in that research and in that topic of thinking about leadership without authority, lateral leadership, whatever you want to call it, and was very impressed by that research and the programs that we did then. I left the company in 2013, went out on my own, and I decided at that point to try to combine. I had the crazy idea that I'd be able to combine my humanities background. That was sort of my academic background, was in the humanities and in philosophy and English literature, and then most recently in Eastern philosophy and literature. I got a master's degree in Eastern classics, which is basically the philosophy and literature of India, China, and Japan. So I had that sort of humanities background, philosophy, literature background, and I always thought it'd be great to combine that somehow with the leadership knowledge that I had. So I ended up writing a book called The Greats on Leadership, and that was taking Western thinkers, great authors, anyone from Plato to Churchill to Jane Austen to Abraham Lincoln, and looking at what they had to say about leadership. And as I was doing tours and kind of talking about that book, people kept asking me, well, what about Eastern thinkers? And what have they got to say about leadership? And I thought that was a really interesting question. And at the time, I was studying Eastern thought for my master's degree. So for the next book that I decided to write, I decided to sort of take the Eastern perspective and combine it with the knowledge that I had about from my previous career about influence without authority or lateral leadership. And so those two came together in this book called The Art of Quiet Influence.
So I love the book. I want to just kind of dive in, maybe from a high level, right? I mean, you're kind of an expert on both sides of the ocean, so to speak. So the general vibe of that first book, which was a little bit more sort of Western based, versus the general vibe of this book, like what were the big kind of differences that you found as, maybe you were writing the book, as you were drawing from these different leaders or these different philosophers, or even just in terms of your humanities background, relative to when
Mhm.
you were getting your Eastern focused masters? What are some of those big kind of flavor profile differences for folks that maybe aren't as well steeped in this stuff as you obviously are?
Yeah, well, I think you need to start with really the definition of influence, because influence is when you say that word, the first thing people often think is persuasion, or, oh, I'm an influencer on social media, that kind of thing. But influence has a specific meaning, at least it did for us at my former company, and sort of in the realm of leadership research. Influence is the ability to work with others collaboratively without relying on positional authority. So most Western leadership training and research, and if you go into a business school and take a leadership course, it's in the West. It's going to have fundamentally a hierarchical idea of what leadership means. Not necessarily that you're a manager, but it certainly sort of has the idea that the leader is in charge, probably a manager, probably a senior manager. And the difference with this book, and what this book explores, is a phenomenon that began really taking hold in the West in the 70s, when prior to that, there had been the way organizations were structured was very hierarchical. And people would go to management training, and what it meant to be a manager is that you had people reporting to you and you had authority over them. And so you needed to learn how to be a manager with authority. But starting in about the late 70s, for a lot of different reasons, that structure began to sort of break down, and people began to need to work across these silos, across the organization, and work with people who they didn't have authority over. So for us at my company, at the Forum Corporation, we began to get requests for training in, how do I work with all these people who don't report to me? And so that was the genesis of this research on influence, or the ability to work with those over whom you don't have authority. What I noticed in my study of Eastern thought is that this type of thinking is very congenial to Eastern thinkers. And I want to be careful not to make, big cultural generalizations here, because obviously, it's not true that everybody in the East is, nicely collaborating, or, anything silly like that. But nevertheless, there is this kind of expectation in many Eastern cultures that the world is not the world is more fluid than we see it in the West. It's not sort of made up of these little atomistic individuals who run around doing their own thing. It's much more communitarian. Things are seen as the very physical world is seen as more fluid rather than made up of discrete objects or things. So this way of thinking, this more fluid, or kind of watery, if you will, way of seeing the world and interacting with other people is a very Eastern way of thinking. So I thought that there would be a lot of insight there.
And what do you think that's rooted in? I mean, because those differences are very stark, and I think excuse me, I appreciate what you said. You don't want to paint with these broad brushstrokes. That's kind of all I paint with, so it's okay. But what do you think that's rooted in from a Western or an Eastern perspective?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, from a Western perspective, the shift from that kind of more hierarchical point of view to the more lateral or collaborative point of view really came about because starting in the 70s, the Japanese manufacturers began to eat our lunch and they had this business philosophy called Kaizen, or continuous improvement, which was about breaking down a company's vertical silos. So, and Japanese employees would work in cross-functional teams, and they were very successful doing that in their manufacturing, and they started to make better cars than than we did in the U.S. So Western manufacturers really took note of that approach and figured, hey, we're really, we need to figure this out too. So that's kind of the origin of this idea of lateral influence in the West. In the East, it's a great question. That goes back millennia to just how with the ancient writings of Hindu writings, Buddhist writings, these great sages of the East have tended to take a much more just a view that the world is more about action or kind of interaction, perhaps, as opposed to individualistic objects and individual people.
Yeah, so that sort of collectivism, perhaps it's rooted in the type of agriculture they did versus us as a bunch of individuals in the West or whatever. But it did lead to your point, they took to sort of this this cross-functional collaboration on a much sort of deeper level. And finally, the dollar was, the almighty dollar must have been threatened, and they said, we have to figure something out. And it sort of opened up this new kind of approach to collaborating and trying to borrow some of that fluidity. So I love that answer. I think that's extremely interesting. We could probably go on and on about like what the roots of this thing are. But I just, I love the kind of 12 Sages framework. I love that whole thing. So how did you boil it down to those 12? And how did you sort of, you kind of put some architecture over all these, while related, but somewhat disparate sort of ideas and thoughts rooted in this Eastern sort of philosophy. You put some architecture around it and were able to pull out a lot of really cool, like the structure of your book, I thought was phenomenal. What was that process like to kind of distill down these different sages to one sort of takeaway that you were able to, again, kind of construct in this kind of cohesive, picture that you painted?
Yeah. So I actually began with some research on teamwork that has become kind of standard in the training industry, and it was originated by a guy named Bruce Tuckman. He had a model called forming, storming, norming, and performing was the shorthand for it, but it was a model for how teams, when they're working together, how they develop. So they go through, group members start out behaving sort of independently, they're getting to know one another. Then they go through a phase that has a lot of conflict and doubts and fights. And then sometimes they get stuck there in the stage he called storming. But usually they're able to work out their differences and they come to sort of adopt a way of working together that he calls norming. And then finally you're really, cooking along, and he calls performing. So I started with that model, and we at Forum had a different names for the stages. There's a lot of different.
Did they rhyme?
The stages. No, they don't rhyme. It wasn't as good. Membership, control, cohesion. It's going to be gone. But I changed it to. It's still a good model. So I changed it to membership, control, performance, which I think really captures the issues that occupy groups as they evolve over time. So it's this idea of a team. You can't just throw a team together and declare you're a team. Okay, collaborate. There are phases that a team goes through. So I started with that, and then looked at what do you need to do? Because I really wanted to get in this book not just at sort of these airy-fairy ideas about influence, but really what should one do? What are the actual practices and actions one can take? And so in these 3 stages of group development, I came up with these 3 core practices for influence. So in the membership stage, what you really need to be doing as a team leader or member is inviting participation. So that's sort of the first core practice, is making people feel like they are involved, like they belong. And there's a big mistake that many of us make where we try to sort of skip over that part. We think it's not important, all that fluffy getting to know you stuff. So, and in fact, it's very important to invite participation, take time to make people feel like a true team.
Why do we miss
so then
that?
If you do,
I'm sorry
I'm sorry
to interrupt, but why do people pay that short shrift? Because I mean, maybe it's after, I've read your book, but I'm in your camp. But why do people miss that, do you think?
I think they think it's just unimportant, and we've got to get on with the work. There's one of my favorite little stories from the people that I interviewed for this book is a friend of mine named Andre Alfonso. He used to be the CEO of Forum India, and he said that he used to draw a graph, and he called it the hassle graph. And on the vertical, and this was in his training programs for teams, and on the vertical axis was hassle. On the horizontal axis was time. And he would draw a line that showed, typically a project starts off very low on hassle, and hassle increases over time. And he said, what you really want, when you really want stuff to be working later in the project, that's when the hassle gets and the conflict and everything gets really high. So what he would say is, you need to move some of that hassle up front. You need to front load the hassle with discussions of roles and ground rules and getting to know each other and all this stuff that people think is just kind of a waste of time. But it's not, because putting that so-called hassle up front pays off later, because then you may have a high level of hassle at the beginning, but the line goes down over time instead of up.
Right, you get a downward sloping line.
The hassle graph.
The hassle. I love that model. It's so true. It's like the more work you do up front, the less you end up kind of having to do later, because that sort of safety is there, that psychological safety, or the membership is there, or hey, we're all pursuing a thing that's bigger than ourselves. I found that in my own life, and I'm just again, these days, right? Like when I was going through college, it was all group work. So at this point, group work is like the name of the game, right? We're in flatter organizations, it's knowledge work, right. We are our work and so forth. It's just kind of baffling that folks still kind of, it's like, you got to stretch before you run. You know what I'm saying? Right. You got to do those, like, make sure your shoes are laced up before you start this marathon. You can't just sort of start running. It's an interesting, it's an interesting error that, to your point, kind of compounds over time and also compounds across organizations when that's not like a habit across the company. You know what I mean?
Exactly. And, we older folks, I don't know how old you are, but we who remember what it was like when this whole teaming thing in the 80s and 90s really began to take off, we had an advantage in a way because it was new. And people didn't really understand what that meant to work in a cross-functional team because they were so used to the sort of hierarchical structure. So they knew they needed tools and help to do that effectively. So they things like ground rules and role matrices and icebreakers, silly icebreakers to get to know each other, and things like that, where people really appreciated because they didn't know how to do this cross-functional teaming thing.
Right.
But nowadays, it's, as you say, it's just expected, and so I think that people now just assume, okay, here we go, here's another project.
Great point.
This is how we work, and off we go, and let's not waste time and get right down to the work. So, and they miss that inviting participation practice.
That's a phenomenal point. Yeah. It's like, oh, we're just, we run all the time, so who needs to stretch? You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So the first stage in your model, just to review, it's kind of participation. The next one is power, sharing power, and then it's aiding in progress. I think this first step, to your point, sets the foundation for what a good team is, what a good foundation for influence is. I loved how you know, you have this section where you talk about like the pitfalls, the Western pitfalls, and obviously this was written sort of for a Western audience, it being in English and so forth. How is relying on reciprocity in terms of demonstrating care for colleagues, like how is that a pitfall that ends up sort of losing its, you know, flavor, so to speak, in the context of sort of trying to be humane and setting those sort of ground rules or that sort of foundation in the relationship, you know?
Yeah. So the Western pitfalls that I have throughout the book, I put those in because again, you know, not to culturally stereotype anybody, but there are certain things that we in the West tend to not understand about this type of influence. And
yeah,
one of the biggest things that we fail to understand is, and this speaks to the second phase of my model, which is to sharing power. It's the not understanding the difference between power, true power, and authority. So I make a big deal out of this, and I think this is probably the most important thing to understand about influence. If you just want to pick out one thing to take away from this book, for me, it would be this understanding that having authority, that is having a title, you know, you're the senior vice president of marketing or whatever, that gives you authority. And that means that, yeah, people are likely to do what you say, at least, or agree with you to your face. But it does not do very much at all to give you true power or influence. And when I talk about power, I'm talking about real power, which is the ability to get work done. So influence is a form of true power. That is not the power that people imagine comes along with a big title or with a corner office, but the real power, the productive power, if you will, that comes from being able to get things done, whatever title or whatever position you have, by working collaboratively with others. So, you know, people in the West especially, I think, get very hung up on this idea of authority, and many of the pitfalls that we fall into have to do with, like, you know, not understanding, hey, well, I just got a promotion and now I'm your manager. You know, I'm these people's manager, and they're not doing what I tell them to do.
right.
So I guess I'll just shout louder, and then they're still not doing what I tell them to do. And so it's that old joke: the beatings will continue until morale improves. You know, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, you should, you know, a big red flag for a leader, you know, if you're running a company and you ever have to pound the table and yell, I'm the CEO of this company, that is you're not doing it right.
Oh, yeah. I had a boss who used to love to pound the table. Didn't work.
I mean, you shouldn't have to, right? I mean, I love that
No.
definition of power, the ability to get work done through others. And it kind of comes down to that age-old question: is it better to be loved or feared? I think if you're feared, then people are going to do kind of the bare minimum. They're going to do just enough to like not get in trouble and not, you know, fall into your ire or whatever. Whereas if you're loved, or you have this true influence, you have this real power, you can get people to kind of go above and beyond and not just do that bare minimum, but to really, you know, put their gifts to work in pursuit of whatever it is you're working on, you know?
Right. Yeah, there's this phrase that you may have heard of called discretionary effort. And we all have that choice as human beings to whether we're going to try a little bit or a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's up to our discretion. And one, you know, another possible definition of influence would be the ability to get people to put in more of their discretionary effort.
Yeah, to run a little bit harder, you know, to redline the engine or whatever. It's so interesting though, because I think in the West in particular, perhaps so much of it is like attributable to personality type, or, you know, of the big five is just like high conscientiousness or something. But I think that discretionary effort is a gas pedal in every single one of us. irrespective of our different personality traits and our, level of conscientiousness or intelligence. And to your point, if you can animate those folks and you can, get them to do what you want them to do, and they want to do it, that's kind of the panacea that I think all leaders are going to go for. And I think for shorthand, like my definition of a leader is just kind of anybody who's willing to do the right thing and, be an example to those around them. So, that doesn't necessarily need to be a title. That can be anybody who wants to kind of step up and try to make a difference in their world. And for the types of folks that we're trying to help and that, this podcast is aimed at, if we can help them, just with a little bit, a few tools that they can, elevate out of, I use this analogy a lot, that they're kind of at the kiddie table and they want to get to the adults table where, profit is discussed and, the offensive team is at, so to speak. To get there, you have to get some light bulbs turned on at the top. And that's going to be part through sort of internal persuasion and part going to be through this thing called influence, to your point, where, folks can start to recognize, oh, wow, I've been looking at HR as this cost center, but, if my people are truly my greatest asset and these individuals, in spite of not having all the budget or not having all the tools, are able to increase my engagement in my broad organization, then man, I've really been overlooking those folks. If we can get those light bulbs turned on for compliance or for ethics or for strategy or for finance or for HR, we can really start to kind of change our workplaces. And that's what, excites me. And that's why I just really love this book, because the whole point is the influence is coming without that authority, which again, in the West is many times a currency that folks kind of over rely on.
Yes, exactly. There's a quote, and I'm not going to remember who said this, but it was one of the people I interviewed for the book, a very wise business coach, said that she had noticed that, and I think this will resonate for your audience, perhaps, that there were people that she worked with on teams that did not have, in their minds, didn't have enough budget, didn't have enough authority, didn't have enough resources. And so she was coaching a woman who was a team leader of one of these teams and project teams. And the woman kept sort of worrying about, well, how do I get more budget? That's my issue, is we need more budget. We need more budget. And my friend, who was the coach, finally said to her, look, stop worrying about how much budget you have or whether you have enough budget or not, because that is not the name of the game. Switch your focus to doing great work with this team. And when you do that, the budget will follow. Now, that's not necessarily always true, that you're not always going to get the budget you want, of course. In fact, rarely will you get the budget you want. But it's certainly more productive to, rather than sort of going back to your boss and kind of, pleading for one, saying, we can't do anything unless we have more budget, or we can't do anything unless you give me the authority to do this. Switch your focus to influence and making it our team, our way, doing great work together, and that's going to be a lot more productive.
Well, and it's also, it shifts it from something that you can't control, where you're sitting in sort of the passenger seat in this car ride, to like grabbing hold of your own agency and saying like, okay, well, I could do something with this. And I have a bunch of human beings, to your point, that are probably not putting the pedal to the metal in terms of their discretionary effort. And if we can animate, activate, whatever, these folks, and in the context of the resources we have, then it's very empowering. It's a very empowering frame that I think a lot of us maybe inadvertently don't want to pick up. Because it's easier to just say, I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth from a departmental standpoint. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So I love this thing about practice patience. This chapter really resonated a lot with me. So, the big takeaway from this chapter was about, developing a shared outlook. Again, this was part of the foundational sort of first pillar of this framework. To me, this is like so critical. If we can resonate on something where we have a shared outlook, or we look at the world the same way, or we have an ethos overlap, as I call it, it just makes it so much easier to sort of speak the same language.
Mm-hmm.
And what you talk about from a pitfall perspective is about, learning about rather than from. So can you talk about what that different posture like means, or how that frame is a little different,
Yeah. So this is chapter 4, influence practice is
Mm-hmm.
practice patience. The sage that I talk about here is Rumi, who is an Islamic mystic, a poet that many people in the West have actually heard of. He's very popular in the West.
Mm-hmm.
Rumi is, and the practice is the chapter title is practice patience, and the influence practice is taking time to develop a shared outlook. So in the West, because of our scientific traditions, I think, we tend to take an attitude that I need to learn about things. So it's treating other people almost as if they were objects. I need to learn about this object and almost, use a scientific method to understand everything, including people. The social sciences, so to speak, are dubbed sciences because we're supposed to be applying scientific methods to human beings, which I have sort of a problem with, but that's a whole other story. Learning about rather than from, as the pitfall suggests, that what we should be trying to do is recognizing that this is another person with agency, just like us, and with things to teach us. So you're not just, if you're a salesperson, for example, and you know that you need to go in and learn all about this client and or this prospect and their industry and their company and what they're all about, and you try to sort of read them, that's fine. But it's much more influential if you also ask their advice, ask what they think, ask what they have to teach you, so that the learning is going both ways. And that two-way learning, I think that attitude of, I can learn from you and you can learn from me, is one of the most powerful ways to have influence, ironically. I mean, we tend to think that we're doing pretty well if we just keep our mouths shut and listen and try to learn about somebody else, and we pat ourselves on the back for that. But in fact, that's only half of the equation. What we also need to be doing is saying, what can this person teach me? What advice can I take from them? And that's actually a very good way to influence somebody, is to learn from them and take their advice.
Well, isn't that funny? I mean, like, to do that, you have to have a bit of humility, and you have to have a bit of an others focus. And just that word, saying, I'm going to learn about this person versus I'm going to learn from them. I mean, when I've read a book about a biography of somebody like a president or something, I mean, just to be candid, I've gone into it like, oh, I want to learn about Lincoln, or I want to learn about Roosevelt or something. But what I've walked away from, just in kind of thinking about those experiences in the context of what you're saying, I've walked away thinking, man, I've learned so much from this person. Mm-hmm. It's just a kind of a humbling thing. You know what I mean?
Right.
And that in and of itself, I guess, to your point, is easier to make a connection with somebody when you feel like you're imparting some wisdom to them, or you're making a connection with them to the point where they actually appreciate it, or, it takes it down to like a deeper level of like a humanity connection,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So let's talk about sharing power, this broad practice. So we've invited some participation. We've started to, and I'm kind of thinking about this whole thing in the context of somebody who's in ethics and compliance, who, again, no budget, kind of, back office type of third line type of function, who's maybe reaching across the aisle to somebody in finance or somebody in strategy to start building this this coalition or something, right? To where, 1 + 1 can equal 3, but there's a little bit of synergy involved that's going to take some influence and some and so forth. So they've invited participation. They've established a shared outlook. Hey, we want to change the world, or we want to change our company and our respective corners of it. Let's talk about like what this broader, middle category of like sharing power looks like, and how that actually works.
Yeah. So what I'd love to talk about here is actually the single most popular concept that in any of my books, and I put it I put it in all my books because people always say, "Oh, I love that thing," and it has to do with sharing power, and it's this notion of um, converting adversaries to allies. There's and again to a Western pitfall here. We have a tendency in the West to see our relationships with others on a two-dimensional, just a line continuum from enemy to friend.
Mm-hmm.
So if I like you and you're nice to me, then I think you're my friend. And if you're not nice to me and I don't like you, I think you're my enemy. And that's the wrong way to think about it if you want to really share power and be influential. A better way to think about it is in a two-dimensional way. Sorry, I should have said before, we think of it in a one-dimensional way.
Right.
You want to think of it in a two-dimensional way where there's four different types of people. There's friends, foes, allies, and adversaries. And you can imagine this on a sort of a 2 by 2 matrix with four quadrants. But if you want, but the point is that um, friends and foes, seeing people as friends and foes is limiting because what you're not seeing is that many times the person who you think is a friend is actually just an ally. And an ally is somebody with whom you share interests. Your interests are aligned. Allies are temporary because interests can change. So if you're my ally and we share an interest in getting this project done or something like that, then we may be allies and be friendly towards each other. But if our interests change and suddenly I become a competitor to you for a job, for example, then you might switch to an adversary. But the good news is that adversaries, that state is also temporary because an adversary is just somebody who is not an enemy, but is somebody with whom your interests are not aligned at that moment. So the mistake that people make often is to assume that somebody is an enemy, that is that person is unconditionally against you, or that a person is a friend, that is that person is unconditionally for you for reasons of either love or duty or some other reason. The friend is going to be sort of with you unconditionally.
Right.
An enemy will be against you unconditionally. And we assume that that's the way things are. It's like, well, I guess that's just the way it is. That person's a jerk. He's my enemy. So forget him. But if you have this two-dimensional understanding with the allies and adversaries, which are conditional states of being, then you know that an ally can switch to an adversary pretty quickly. But good news, if you have an adversary and you can figure out a way to align your interests with that person, that adversary can flip in an instant to becoming an ally. So this is a very powerful switch in mindset I've found, and many of the people that I speak to find this just extremely useful. My daughter loves this framework. She says it changed her life. She's 23 and in graduate school, but when she realized that she didn't have to think of everybody as either a friend or an enemy, but realize that most people are just allies or adversaries, and you can work to make more of them allies. It's very useful.
Yeah, and we kind of get burrowed into that backward thinking just from that saying, my enemy's enemy is my friend. I mean, it should really say my adversary's adversary is my ally, because it's like that's that whole conditional piece there.
Yes.
How did your daughter find it to be so useful? It just kind of freed the world up and made it a little like less black and white, or what?
Yeah, this was a few years ago. She went and did she had a summer job as a counselor at it was at Northwestern University for a for kids. So it was like a kids summer camp, kind of a gifted children
Mm-hmm.
summer camp type of thing. And she was a counselor there, and it was a tough job with people who had her fellow counselors had come in from all over the country, and some of them didn't want to be there, and it's a kids camp, and you can imagine the that just the trials of that type of a job. And it was right at the beginning of that her time there that I introduced her to this idea of friends, foes, allies, adversaries. And she said in her first week at that camp, it flipped her perspective, where she realized that because there were some people that she didn't really get along with at first, and she was like, oh, I don't like them, and they don't like me, and so she was struggling. And then she suddenly realized, oh wait, I don't have to be friends with everybody. That friends and enemies are not the only two choices. I can try to make allies out of these people, and that is just fine. In fact, in this situation, it's much more useful to have
Right.
allies than it is to have friends, and that's often true in work situations.
Well, and that sort of unconditional nature of those other two terms leads to sort of a permanence that is assumed for the person in that role. And it's like, well, they might just be a friend for now, or they might just be a foe for now.
Mm-hmm.
That just loosens it up so much. And it just opens your mind up to like, okay, this person isn't necessarily in this bucket with this label tattooed to them. This could just be a Post-it note that's on their chest for the moment,
Right.
So I love this chapter about follow the leaders. And the pitfall on this one was about using rules and edicts to exert control. And what we're really talking about is backing those who lead. So talk to us a little bit about this whole concept of how we can sort of lead from the back.
Yes, backing those who take the lead. Yeah, this is actually this is a chapter that people don't often ask me about. That's funny that you zero in on that, because it's one of my favorites. This is
Me too.
The Eastern sage that I talk about here is Sima Qian, who is the Grand Historian of China. He writes these just fantastic historical records of early China around the second or third century BC, and he writes about this particular leader. He became a king, and sort of a ruler, a king, emperor, whatever you want to call him. His name is Gaozu, and Gaozu was this sort of country bumpkin who, through a series of strange events, rose to become this great military leader and a king. And he Gaozu would actually, Sima Qian anyway, thinks that he presents him as intentionally playing up his own kind of stupidity and bumbling nature, because he wanted the people around him to feel smarter than him. Like he knew that was, and you may have heard some leaders talk about this. Like I want to be surrounded by people who are smarter than me. Now it's pretty rare that somebody has the confidence to actually do that. To be in a position of authority and yet surround yourself with people who are smarter than you and really take their advice. But this is what Gaozu did. He hired and it's why Sima Qian says he was the greatest leader of all, because he hired the best generals and he gave those generals control. And he even went so far as to, sort of play the fool a little bit and laugh at himself, when and that would encourage people to kind of, kick him under the table, so to speak, if he was making a mistake, or his advisors thought he was making a mistake. He actually would allow them to give him a little nudge or kick or something, which was really not on for the typical Chinese ruler at the time. You'd probably get your head chopped off. But he just sort of he played the bumpkin for his whole life, and managed to achieve extreme loyalty from his followers, because he he allowed them to lead him. So he didn't just assume, well, I'm a leader, everybody's got to follow me. He also was a follower as well.
I just I loved that story of him getting kicked under the table, and just to your point, I mean, again, at that time, that would have been death, and
Right.
this confidence in himself to do that, and caring more about the thing they were after, the purpose of what he was going after beyond his own ego, which is really what it kind of boiled down to, is a great picture of what I think every sort of super secure leader should be trying to do, or should be able to do, I guess I should say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's a really cool chapter. And in ethics and compliance in particular, we see this a lot. We see, the sort of old school approach to ethics and compliance is that, compliance's job is to keep the company out of, trouble, keep the company from getting sued, keep the boss out of jail, right? So if you can think about what the power dynamics end up, again, this is broad brushstrokes, and many times the power dynamics that end up coming into play are this, again, cost center function that doesn't get the respect it needs, but it is tasked with keeping folks out of jail. So it's pushing out policies that are backed up by regulations, and they kind of walk around, stereotypically walk around with like a hammer and saying, well, you have to follow this, right? And just trying to use these rules and these regulations to get people to do what they need them to do, as opposed to, translating that into why they should want to do what they're needed to do.
Right. Right.
So it's a bit of a different posture, and it had some nice overlap with this chapter, especially in the context of these Western pitfalls, of using rules and edicts to exert control, as opposed to, again, this guy was able to get so much loyalty from his people because he was able to meet those people where they were at, use their gifts and strengths, and to complement him and so forth. So there's just some really cool, interesting interplay between, this group that we try to serve, and these really cool historical anecdotes, that you captured in this chapter. So this one really stuck out to me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel for people in that kind of position, because I can completely understand. It's like, why don't these people see that these rules are necessary and they have to comply with them, and if they don't, then we're all going to go to jail, or
Right.
or our CEO is going to go to jail. So it does seem rational that I can feel the frustration of your audience here, and why won't these people follow the rules? But there's just there's so many stories that I share in this book of the people, and especially in this chapter where I talk about a particular type of power chaser called the legalist.
Right.
And the legalist is the person who tries to maintain control by using rules and edicts. There's a famous Chinese emperor called the First Emperor. He was the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, and he was famous for being the architect of legalism, which is this philosophy that says, okay, we're going to bring order to things. We're going to have laws. We're going to have strict enforcement of these laws. We're going to have harsh punishment for lawbreakers. And he was very famous for having this rigid regime that actually worked for a time. I mean, it was, everything, all the weights and measures were standardized. The railway gauges were standardized, so you could have trains running across the country. The Great Wall of China was a project of his. He began the Great Wall of China.
Wow.
As a way of protecting the country. He also burned a lot of books because he said we've got to have everybody united. There's got to be a single source of authority. Here are all these scholars running around disputing things, and so we're gonna ban those scholars. We're gonna burn the books. And he thought that his reign, he had these tablets set up all around the place saying, my reign is going to, or this administration is going to last for 10,000 years, or whatever. Well, it lasted for like 15 years, and then his son came along and totally failed, and so the whole thing just collapsed within 15 years roughly. And this is one of the problems of this authoritarian,
Right.
These authoritarian attempts, is that they may last for a while, but they don't last for very long.
Yeah, it's not sustainable. What do you think the lack of sustainability is? I mean, does it go back to that sort of discretionary effort thing, or what?
Yeah, well, I think you're not. Human beings are just notoriously independent.
Yeah.
We think for ourselves. Now, in some societies are more, particularly in the East, they're more communitarian, and people will do what they're told, particularly by their parents, more so than we do in the West. But even so, all over the world, human beings are just much more intractable than anybody likes to think. And as soon as the fear of punishment is gone, or even while the fear of punishment is still there, we just have this. We as human beings have this tendency to kind of thumb our nose and say,
Right.
Heck with you, I'm going to do what I want, and you can't stop me. So, give me a reason to do what you're telling me to do. Make me feel like I'm part of something. Make me feel like you respect me, that I have some say here. That is going to be what lasts, rather than,
Right.
you just kind of waving the stick and threatening me.
Yeah, we're not horses, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
a horse will wear the bridle and wear the blinders or whatever, as long as you put them on them.
Yeah, that's right.
Super interesting chapter. I just love this book, in case you can't tell. Like, there's so much I don't know about the East, and you really pulled so many cool stories and anecdotes and these sages. It's really a masterful thing that you put together here. So let's jump into the last category, or the last sort of part of the frame, which is about aiding progress.
Mm-hmm.
And the first chapter in here was about mindfulness and establishing mindfulness. So this is like turning into a bit of a buzzword. Everyone's talking about mindfulness. They got mindfulness apps now, and there's a bunch of duplicate mindfulness apps out there and everything else. What do you mean by mindfulness in the context of aiding in progress, and how do you see us sort of get it wrong, or do you see any sort of caricatures of what sort of pure mindfulness is sort of present today?
Yeah, so mindfulness as a concept actually originated with the Buddha, with Gautama Buddha, and was a much more, shall we say, I guess difficult concept than people like to think today. Today, it's tended to become, okay, let's all just relax. So there's mindfulness conferences, and you start, it's like, let's take a deep breath and be mindful. What does that mean? I guess it just means I should kind of relax. So yeah, it's irritating. It also, I think that we think of it today as purely a personal thing, and it's kind of seen as kind of fluffy by a lot of business people. Just why would I pay to help my people relax and
do that on your own time?
Find their spiritual, yeah, exactly. To find your spiritual bliss on your own time. The way the Buddha talked about mindfulness, and the way I think is very helpful actually as a concept, is it's the ability to observe your own thoughts and emotions with detachment, and it results in a stronger self, because there's this tendency that we as humans have to let our minds. In Buddhism, it's called the monkey mind. The mind jumps around and can get very afraid of certain things, or get very distracted. And what Buddhism teaches is that you are capable of. There's a witness that is sort of more truly you than your distractible, scared, um, mind. So if you can harness that witness, and rather than sort of thinking, oh my gosh, I'm freaking out here, I'm all, the things are overwhelming me, you can kind of sit back, and it's almost like watching a movie, watching yourself as a movie, and say, okay, I'm not going to try to run from this. I'm going to observe. And so you observe what's happening to your body, you observe what's happening to your mind, you watch the thoughts come and go, is what they often say, what Buddhists often say. You watch the thoughts come and go like clouds in the sky.
Yeah.
It's a way to not only gain strength and control over yourself, but it's also something that can spread. And I talk about that in this chapter because the Buddha talks about establishing mindfulness, which is an interesting concept, because if you think of it as just a purely personal thing, how could you establish mindfulness? But he talks about it as if the person who is mindful, the leader or influencer who is mindful, has the ability to spread this attitude, if you will, throughout his or her team, his or her company, his or her group. So it's catching.
It is
in a
catching.
good way. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so I think it takes a certain I don't know, like security in yourself, or a certain like lack of ego to not only be able to like truly look at those clouds passing, as you say, and say, is that a good one? Is that a bad one? Whatever. But then to your point, if you're going to make it catch, to start sharing those externally, right? Like you have to assume sort of a psychologically safe environment to like even engage in that, right? And that perhaps is what can help kind of create that tipping point for more folks to engage in it and admit when, hey, that was a really, below the line type of, I don't know. Just the catching of the mindfulness, I think, is a really interesting concept. Like, talk to me some more about how you've seen, or hypothetically, how you could see that actually happening sort of in an organizational, state or, environment.
Well, I mean, just back to the example I shared of the guy who used to pound on the table. Mm-hmm. That boss, it was palpable. You could feel the fear in the room, or at least mm-hmm. the edginess in the room, and eventually in the entire company whenever he showed up. In contrast, another boss, many other bosses I've been fortunate to have, but I remember one in particular, I named him in the book, Ed Boswell was his name. He, his attitude was just one of calm. So, there would be occasions when he like lost
sure.
his temper a little bit, but after that he would almost always apologize, and his usual demeanor was calm and inclined to listen more than speak. So when you went into a meeting with him, the feeling was one of relaxation, and we all, it was like it was like dogs following the the alpha dog.
Yeah,
the
right.
Alpha dog is relaxed, then all the other dogs are relaxed. But it's not just bosses that have that effect. I think that we underestimate. There's some research that I cite by Teresa Amabile, Stephen Kramer is their name, and they wrote a book called The Progress Principle, and they did some research on inner work life. So how sort of the flow of perceptions and emotions that make up our experiences on the job, and they found that what was surprising is the degree to which the inner work life of their research subjects was shaped by everyday interactions with colleagues, not by their personality, not by just what their boss did, but just everyday interactions. So if you are somebody who is has this mindful attitude that sort of demonstrates a positive and controlled inner work life, this also relates back to my chapter on climate. You know, if you create sort of your own positive climate for yourself, then that has a surprisingly quick ability to spread throughout, you know, all the people that you interact with.
Yeah, I mean, it's so contagious. And,
yeah,
you know, we tend to only think about like germs as being contagious, but really your mood and your energy can, you know, influence, to your point, everybody around you. I mean, it's so
right.
true. I've worked with folks like that where you're just like, man, you gotta, you know, your kid's gotta be miserable because I'm kind of miserable. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So great. Well, listen, I just want to be conscious of time because I feel like we could go on for probably another couple of hours. This has been absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much for coming on and joining us and, you know, sharing some more of your wisdom and insights. I mean, anybody who has not picked up The Quiet Art of Influence, it is highly, highly recommended. Jocelyn Davis, I'm excited to read more of your work. And do you have any other fun projects coming out here? No pressure, of course.
I do. I have my novel. My first novel is coming out.
Tell us
in
about
March, and the name of it is The Age of Kali. It is a historical novel set in ancient India, and it's actually a reimagining of one of the ancient Indian epics, the Mahabharata, which is this sweeping tale of war and family and sort of a family saga. But the way I reimagine it is with the villain as the good guy and the good guys as the villains. So it's a turning upside down of a ancient Indian epic. It's called The Age of Kali, and it'll be out soon.
Oh, wow. Oh, cool. Well, thank you again, Jocelyn, so much for joining us. Pick up The Age of Kali this spring and pick up The Art of Quiet Influence while you're waiting. There's so many actionable things you can take to elevate your impact in your organization and start leading without authority and start changing the world. So thank you so much.
Thank you.